Hi, my name is Sadiq, owner, instructor of Realty and Insurance U. And in this video, I want to bring some clarity to the buyer brokerage agreements in relationship to the agency agreements right here in Florida. You want to make sure you stick around to hear this video. Again, my name is Sadiq, and in this video, I want to talk about clarifying the buyer's brokerage agreements in relationship to agency relationships in Florida. Now, this is particular to licensees in Florida. If you're licensed in any other state, you may be able to glean some of the information that I'm sharing with you and try to use some of the concepts to make sense in your particular state. But this presentation in this video is for individuals in Florida. Now, again, Hamid Sadiq, licensed real estate broker in Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. Also licensed real estate instructor right here in the state of Florida. Over 25 years of experience in the business. And I'm going to use that experience to help bring clarity to these documents that we have to utilize right here in Florida. And of course, many realtors around the nation. In the bottom right-hand corner is my electronic business card to access many of the other classes that I have available. But let's take a look here. The first thing I want you to understand is that NAR settlement rules do not change Florida Real Estate Commission principles, practices, and law. Chapter 475 is still there. Everything that we learned dealing with, it's still there. Now, before we get started, and I give some examples, I want to lay the foundation on a few things so that we'll be on the same page as we go through a few scenarios. First, I'm going to utilize Florida Real Estate Principles, Practices, and Law by Linda Crawford and Denise Stoller, the 47th edition. So a couple of things I want to go over with you first. Number one, page 68, lines 22 through 24. A broker working in a no brokerage relationship capacity with the seller can enter into a listing agreement with the seller and be paid compensation. Similarly, a brokerage firm working in a no brokerage relationship capacity can work with a buyer. This is very important. So understand basically what it's saying in this paragraph here is that when you're working with a buyer or a seller in a no brokerage relationship, you can work with them and you can be paid and compensated. So no brokerage does not mean no money. You could be in no brokerage relationships and still be compensated. Make sure you keep that clear. Number two, page 76, lines 7 through 9. A realtor that isn't a single agent. Let me start that over. A realtor that is a single agent to the seller can work with a buyer in a no brokerage relationship in the same transaction. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus more on single agency relationships. Now, when the Florida Real Estate Commission was going through all of these things with us some months back, their focus was looking at it from the transaction brokerage scenario. I'm going to lean more on the single agency to bring clarity to that. Because if you look at number two, sometimes a person may think because you're a single agent that you cannot work with an unrepresented buyer, and you can. What you can't do is work as a single agent and represent the buyer, but you can work with them. Those are two different things. Working with someone, representing someone are two different things. So number two, in Florida Real Estate Principles, Practices, and Law, it lets us know, hey, I could be a single agent. And if a buyer comes to me unrepresented, then I can actually work with them, but I can't represent them. I think sometimes people think that they can't do anything with that person if they're a single agent. But when reality is, the law says you can work with them, but you can't represent them. And we're going to use an example in just a little bit so we can find out. Let's take a look at this one. Page 67, line 33, and page 68, lines 1 through 3. A brokerage relationship can be accidentally, inadvertently, created by a licensee's actions and words. For an example, referring to a prospective purchaser as my buyer or my client may imply that the licensee is representing the buyer when in actuality, the brokerage is representing the seller. So in your words, you can do something where you will accidentally end up doing another relationship based on your actions and words. Now, let me show you how that can relate when it comes to the new forms from NAR, where we have to use the buyer agreements. This is the challenge that we're running into. If you look at the transaction broker notes situation, you'll notice that some of this information on the transaction broker notice using skill, care, knowledge, presenting offers, using broker's professional knowledge, assist consumer negotiating. This is the buyer brokerage agreement. And this also goes for the shoring agreement. It has some brokerage obligations as well. This is what the challenge is. Here it is, I have a relationship, but then here comes these buyer agreements that if I'm not careful, I may be practicing dual agencies. Let's say if I'm doing a single agency. That's what you have to watch out for. Those different responsibilities that you will find in those buyer brokerage agreements. But don't worry, when we get to the examples, I'm going to bring some clarity. But I wanted to show you where the challenge comes from by inadvertently or accidentally getting in a situation where you should not be working with someone and you basically creating dual agency. And again, my focus in this video is about you being a single agent and how that can happen by bringing in one of those buyer agreements that has this information that mirrors being a transaction broker. And you know, in Florida, you cannot be a single agent and a single agent to the seller and a transaction broker to the buyer. You can't do that. Just because you don't fill out the form, but if you bring one of those buyer brokerage agreements in, you're basically being a transaction broker, and that's illegal in Florida. And we're going to talk more about that. The last one. The next one. Page 76, lines 9 to 11. The brokerage firm cannot represent the buyer as a single agent or work with the buyer as a transaction broker if the firm is also representing the seller as a single agent. You can't do it. And I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute. I thought you said as a single agent, I could work with the buyer. You can, but this is saying something different. The brokerage firm cannot represent the buyer as a single agent or work. Don't let that throw you off because it's saying work with the buyer as a what? As a transaction broker. Now you have limited representation, so you can't represent the seller and have any type of representation to the buyer. This is illegal. Remember, you can't represent a buyer if you're in a single agent, but you can work with them. It's two different things. So make sure you keep those things separate, okay? So I wanted to go over those things with you. I want you to hold on to those rules and laws, vitally important, and let's talk about these documents that we receive. The Florida Real Estate Commission agency agreements. We have single agency, transaction broker, no brokerage relationship. And then comes the Florida Real Estate Commission buyer agreements, NAR requirements, buyer's brokerage agreement, showing agreement, and the often overlooked pre-touring agreement. Not sure why realtors overlook the pre-touring agreement. The pre-touring agreement is vitally important, especially if you work for a brokerage or you're working in a scenario where you're a single agent. And let's give some examples so you see exactly what I'm talking. Let's say one example. You have a listing. The listing is a single, and you get the listing as a single agent. Here comes the buyer. The buyer has no representation, not working with a realtor whatsoever. But the buyer likes you so much and asks you, well, can you work with me? Remember, you're a single agent. And this buyer says they like you so much and they ask the question, can they work with you? What's the answer? The answer is yes. Yes, you can. Now, what can't you do? You can't represent them. Remember, it's two different things. And sometimes we don't separate these things out. So, watch this. I go to my seller and I talk to my seller and I say, hey, listen, I have a buyer, they're not represented. They want me to work with him. And your seller agrees to sign the transition to transaction broker. Why am I bringing that up? In many cases, a lot of brokerages will require you to transition to transaction broker. And then some realtors prefer to do a transition to transaction broker so you won't get into any trouble, right? Now I have limited representation on both sides. My focus is on the transaction. It works out that way. Let's say they sign it, you do the transaction broker, not a lot of problem. But what if you do this? Same scenario. I go to the seller, I get a listing agreement, single agency. I come to the buyer, same buyer, no representation, same scenario. They like how you're doing things and say, can you work with me? The answer is yes. You go back to the seller, but you want to go ahead and transition to transaction broker. So you tell the seller, I want to go ahead and have you sign this transition to transaction broker. And your seller says no. Because when you sat down and did that listing agreement, you said you was going to give them confidentiality, you was going to give them obedience, and they were not going to sign that transition to transaction broker. So now in this scenario, when you come back to the buyer, this is where the challenge come in. I want you to pay attention to these documents, what I'm getting ready to tell you. Can you still work with this customer? The answer is yes. What you can't do is represent them. So now I need to give them two documents. The first document that I need to give them from the agency perspective is a no brokerage relationship. Because remember, if we don't give them anything by default in Florida, we're working as a transaction broker. And if your seller did not want to sign off on transitioning and you're a single agent, you can't be a transaction broker. So be careful on not giving a document because by default, it will be transaction broker and you will be breaking the law in Florida. So make sure if you stay a single agent, you give that buyer a no brokerage relationship. Now comes the buyer's agreements, and now this is causing a problem again. Now, based on NAR rules, you have to give them an agreement. You can't give them a buyer's brokerage agreement. Why? If I go to the buyer brokerage agreement, it have these broker obligations, and these broker obligations are similar to me being a single agent or a transaction broker. I can't do that one. What about the showing agreement? It has brokerage obligations as well. I can't give them that document because I'll be breaking the law. The only document you can give them, the often overlooked, not paid attention to, is the pre-touring agreement. Look at the pre-touring agreement. It doesn't have any brokerage obligation whatsoever. So if you're in a situation or scenario, you are a single agent and you have a buyer and you want to work with that buyer and you want to get compensated from that buyer, or you can just get the compensation from your seller. It can go in a lot of different directions. But what you will have to give them is a no brokerage relationship to satisfy the agency relationship in Florida, so you won't be doing dual agency. And to satisfy NAR requirements, you have to give them a pre-touring agreement. You cannot give them a showing. You cannot give them a buyer's brokerage because you'll be breaking the law. No brokerage, pre-touring agreement, and you will be able to work with that buyer that has no representation. Why am I bringing this up? It's because a lot of times people are wondering, well, what if they don't have any representation? I can't work with them. We can't do anything. Yes, you can. But I do want to share this with you. You truly have to understand the no brokerage relationship if you do that. This is why everything that I've shared with you, and again, these things are going a lot of different directions, but I wanted to lean on the single agency a little bit in this video so that you could really understand what can occur in that. You still have to understand what your brokerage policies and procedures are. Your brokerage has policies and procedures, and some brokerages may not allow you to be a single agent, no brokerage, and do these different things. So I'm giving you some rules. That's the overriding rules. Check with your brokerage, check with your team, and understand what your policies are so that you don't break the policies of your brokerage. So I just wanted to give you those particular rules. So when you are dealing with customers, I wanted to make sure we understood some of these ideas behind no brokerage relationship because we're going to run into these things. Now that NAR has come in with these additional documents that if you use them improperly, they will accidentally have you in an area where you're doing dual agency. But one of the documents that's overlooked is the pre-touring agreement. Not sure why that's not used. That document will allow you to work with someone without putting yourself in a position where you may be doing dual agency. It works perfectly with the no brokerage relationship if you pair those two together. So make sure you have a conversation with your brokerage team. If you have any questions about anything, feel free to email questions to me, or you can put questions in the comment section and we can talk about these things even more. But what I wanted to do is just to touch on some things dealing with single agency. But I tell you, there's so much more to this. If you have a particular scenario that you're trying to figure out, feel free to drop that in the comment section, and we'll do our best to help bring clarity to that situation. Hope this information is beneficial to you. I know a lot of these documents and everything is confusing, but I hope this brought you some clarification.